June 4th, 1940, late afternoon, the House of Commons, Westminster. The benches were crowded, the air heavy with smoke and dread when Winston Churchill rose to speak. Outside the chamber, the fate of Britain hung in a narrow strip of gray water, the English Channel, now all that remained between survival and annihilation. France was collapsing. Belgium had fallen. The Dutch had already surrendered. The British Army had just escaped destruction at Dunkirk, leaving behind nearly all its heavy weapons. There would be no second miracle. Churchill stood knowing that Britain was now alone. Not metaphorically alone, strategically alone. The United States watched from across the Atlantic, sympathetic but distant. The Soviet Union was downed by a pact with Hitler. The Dominions could offer loyalty, not salvation. If Germany invaded, and all intelligence said it would, there would be no Allied landing divisions on English soil to stop it. The Prime Minister understood something more dangerous than German tanks or Luftwaffe bombers. He understood collapse could come from within, from fear, from doubt, from the quiet decision made in thousands of private minds that resistance was hopeless. He also understood that this moment could not be rehearsed again. When he began to speak, he did not offer comfort, he offered truth, sharpened into resolve. He told Parliament that the evacuation from Dunkirk was not a victory. He warned that wars were not won by withdrawals. He forced the room to confront the reality it wanted to avoid. Invasion was coming. The German army stood across the Channel with nearly 3 million men. Britain could muster fewer than 300,000 trained soldiers at home. Fighter command was strong but finite. The Royal Navy was powerful but stretched across the globe. Churchill was not trying to persuade the enemy. He was not trying to impress history. He was trying to prevent surrender before a single German boot touched English sand. What he said next would become more than a speech. It would become a line that replaced allies, a declaration that substituted for certainty, words intended to harden a nation for suffering that had not yet begun but was now inevitable.
Churchill's voice cut through the murmurs in the chamber, deliberate and unflinching. "We shall fight on the beaches," he declared, and the words landed like cannon fire across the minds of those assembled. Every syllable was measured, every pause intentional, designed to do what armies could no longer do, instill belief. He painted a stark portrait of the coming struggle, not with abstract heroism, but with exactitude. Beaches would be bombarded, towns would burn, cities would face aerial siege. The Channel ports, gateways for Britain's lifeline to the world, could not all be held. Yet, he insisted, Britain would not capitulate. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must grasp the broader catastrophe unfolding in Europe. Paris had fallen on June 14. Marshal Philippe Pétain was already negotiating an armistice with Hitler, signaling the swift, almost unimaginable collapse of France. The French army, once considered the backbone of continental defense, had been shattered in 6 weeks of lightning warfare. Britain's continental allies, the last hope for any meaningful counterattack, no longer existed. And even the Dunkirk evacuation, codenamed Operation Dynamo, though hailed as miraculous, had delivered back to England barely half of the men who had faced the German juggernaut. Most of their artillery, vehicles, and supplies remained on the sands of France. Britain's army had returned, alive but impotent. In this context, Churchill's words carried an almost mystical weight. Letters from terrified constituents piled on his desk. Cabinet ministers whispered fears of defeat, of negotiation, even of abdication. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, argued quietly for approaching Hitler with terms to save Britain's cities. The generals, though loyal, questioned whether the nation could endure a protracted campaign alone. Morale was fraying at the edges. And yet, in this crucible, Churchill's rhetoric became more than speech. It became a strategy. By asserting that Britain would never surrender, he transformed despair into resolve. His words were a weapon, sharpened to compensate for the absence of troops, armor, and allies. Across London, air raid sirens now wailed intermittently, a chilling reminder of the Luftwaffe's growing dominance. Factories worked frantically to replace lost equipment. Shipyards strained to maintain the Royal Navy's global reach. Newspapers, often sensational, now printed his speech in full, giving the public a mantra: fight, survive, endure. The language was simple, yet its intent was profound. It substituted for certainty, for a tangible ally, for the assurances that no longer existed. By evening, Churchill returned to 10 Downing Street, exhausted but resolute. In his private diary he would later write of that day, "The war is the struggle of Britain herself against the might of a nation that thinks itself invincible. Our task is not to hope, but to act boldly, unflinchingly." There was no room for hesitation. Every syllable in Parliament, every line of his broadcast to the nation was calibrated to one purpose: prevent collapse before battle even arrived. And yet the path forward was perilous. The next steps would demand more than words. They would demand sacrifice, endurance, and the unimaginable courage of a nation confronting annihilation. Every decision, every deployment, every broadcast became part of a delicate balance to make Britain believe it could survive, even when survival seemed impossible.
The night of June 4th stretched long and silent across London, yet sleep was a luxury no one could afford. Churchill remained at his desk in 10 Downing Street, poring over maps that were as stark as they were terrifying. The English coastline, from Dover to Cornwall, was now the front line of a war that had yet to touch English soil. Intelligence reports placed the German Sixth Army, fresh from France, poised for an invasion codenamed Operation Sea Lion. 3 million men, supported by 2,500 tanks and hundreds of aircraft, waited across the Channel. Britain could muster barely 300,000 trained troops, most of them poorly equipped for a sustained defense. Every port, every airfield, every town along the southern coast was vulnerable. In the cabinet, debates raged into the night. Lord Halifax, cautious and measured, counseled negotiation, warning that resistance without allies was folly. Military advisors outlined grim scenarios: towns flattened by air raids, entire divisions annihilated before they could regroup, civilians caught in crossfire. Yet Churchill would not waver. Every plan he considered, every map he traced with a pencil, carried the same unyielding message: surrender was not an option. It was not even a whisper in his mind. On June 5th, the first public broadcast of his speech reached the nation. The radio waves carried his voice into bomb shelters, factories, and homes. He did not offer illusions. He spoke of the beaches, the landing grounds, the streets where battle would rage. He warned of the bombs that would fall, the cities that might burn. And yet, in that meticulous honesty, he planted the seed of resolve. He told Britain that the nation could endure because it must. That message traveled faster than any army, reaching every corner of a country that was suddenly realizing it stood alone. Across the Channel, German planners watched the reports with disbelief. They had anticipated a broken Britain, cowed by France's collapse. They had expected panic, capitulation, a swift political resolution. Instead, they saw a nation galvanized, unified by a single, unshakable voice. Hitler himself, in his Berlin headquarters, noted with annoyance the stubborn defiance emanating from London. Propaganda broadcasts attempted to belittle Churchill, yet his words only seemed to harden the British will. Every town that read, every radio that played, became a battleground of morale. Private diaries from ordinary citizens reveal the weight of his impact. A clerk in Manchester wrote of pacing his flat, inspired yet terrified. "He does not promise us victory. He promises only that we must stand, and somehow I believe him." Factory workers in Sheffield labored through the night to produce what little equipment remained, driven not by command, but by a sense that the survival of their island depended on their endurance. The nation, stripped of allies, was forced to fight with its heart first, its army second. By June 6th, the contours of inevitability had hardened. There would be no last-minute rescue, no coalition army to step onto British soil. The decision had been made, collectively but unspoken. The nation would face the storm alone. And in that decision lay both terror and clarity. Churchill's voice had transformed from words into a framework of survival. Britain now had a leader who spoke truth with unwavering conviction, and a country that understood it had no alternative but to follow. By mid-June 1940, the full weight of isolation pressed upon Britain. The evacuation at Dunkirk had salvaged lives, but it had left the army hollow and the nation exposed. Coastal defenses were hastily reinforced with barbed wire, minefields, and improvised militias, many of them civilians armed with rifles, shotguns, and sheer determination. The Royal Navy patrolled the Channel tirelessly, yet even its strength could not stop the specter of invasion looming so close. The Luftwaffe intensified its reconnaissance and harassment raids, testing Britain's defenses, probing the skies for weakness. Every raid, every low-flying bomber was a stark reminder that the storm was imminent. In the government's corridors, tension had become almost unbearable. Churchill convened cabinet meetings where the mood was grim and urgent. Military leaders outlined worst-case scenarios: southern ports obliterated, airfields lost, divisions trapped in open countryside. Halifax and others continued to push for negotiation, quietly arguing that the nation's survival might require compromise with Hitler. Yet Churchill's determination was absolute. To surrender, he understood, would not merely be a political choice, it would be a moral annihilation. He saw that Britain's spirit, its pride, its resolve, was itself a weapon, and if it faltered, the enemy would never need to land a single soldier. On June 18th, Churchill delivered another broadcast to the nation. His tone had sharpened, almost surgical in its precision. He acknowledged the bleak reality. France had fallen, the Empire's allies were distant, and the threat of invasion was unprecedented. Yet in the same breath, he transformed fear into duty, terror into resolve. "If the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years," he declared, "men will still say this was their finest hour." These words were not consolation, they were a strategic act of defiance. With every syllable, he substituted for armies he no longer had, for allies who could not intervene, for certainty that simply did not exist. The reaction was immediate. Across the country, towns and villages began to organize themselves for civil defense. Air raid precautions were enacted with vigor. Factories increased production, often beyond capacity. Ordinary citizens, school teachers, clerks, farmers, found themselves conscripted into a national effort of vigilance and preparation. It was as if Churchill's speech had given the populace a single, indivisible instruction: endure, resist, survive. And resist they did, even as the shadow of German invasion crept closer each day. In private, Churchill remained haunted. Diaries reveal long nights spent reviewing maps, war plans, and intelligence reports. Every decision carried the weight of potential catastrophe. Yet even in solitude, he recognized that the irreversible choice had been made. Britain would not surrender, not because it could defeat Germany in conventional terms, but because it had no alternative but to endure. To falter now would mean annihilation. To stand was perilous, yet necessary. That choice crystallized the moment of no return. The nation, leader and citizen alike, had committed to a struggle it could not avoid. The coming months would demand sacrifices unimaginable to most, and the human cost would be enormous. But Churchill had ensured that even alone, Britain's fate was no longer determined solely by enemy forces. It would be determined by the resolve of its own people.
By the summer of 1940, Britain had become a nation transformed, not by armies or fleets, but by words. Churchill's speeches, delivered with a calculated gravity, had replaced allies, artillery, and certainty. They had become the scaffolding upon which Britain's resistance rested. The threat of invasion, Operation Sea Lion, still hung like a sword above the southern coast, yet the country no longer waited passively. Instead, it braced, organized, and steeled itself. Streets, once quiet with civilian life, now thrummed with drills, air raid practices, and the relentless labor of preparation. The immediate consequences of Churchill's defiance were profound. Politically, his leadership was unchallenged. Those who had advocated negotiation or compromise were gradually silenced, either by the logic of necessity or by the weight of public support for the Prime Minister. The cabinet, once fractured by fear and uncertainty, now operated under a single, unyielding directive: no surrender, no retreat, no compromise. Militarily, the message resonated as well. Fighter Command, still outnumbered in the skies, began to train with renewed intensity, aware that every sortie would now carry the burden of national survival. Coastal defenses were reinforced, and the Home Guard, composed largely of volunteers, became a symbol of collective determination, a living testament to Churchill's words made flesh. Reactions across Europe were equally telling. German intelligence reported the unexpected steadfastness of Britain. Hitler's assumption that a broken France would guarantee an easy subjugation of the island was proving false. Berlin's propagandists struggled to understand a populace seemingly galvanized by rhetoric alone. And far across the Atlantic, in Washington and Ottawa, diplomats watched with cautious awe as a solitary nation, bereft of immediate allies, stood its ground against the greatest military force in the world. The historical meaning of June 1940 and the weeks that followed extends far beyond Churchill's personal courage or eloquence. Britain's defiance marked a turning point, not because the German invasion had been repelled, Operation Sea Lion would never be attempted, but because it established a principle: that the survival of a nation is often determined as much by belief, morale, and resolve as by troops and weapons. Churchill's speeches transformed fear into action, hesitation into discipline, despair into determination. They demonstrated that leadership, wielded with clarity and unwavering conviction, could substitute for armies when none were available. In the end, the story of Churchill and Britain in June 1940 is a story of irreversible choice. Once the nation committed to stand alone, there was no retreat, no compromise, no turning back. Every day thereafter became an act of courage, every defensive measure a testament to the decision made in those dark days. Britain had chosen to fight, not because victory was guaranteed, but because surrender would have been unthinkable. In doing so, it set the stage for the eventual resurgence of Allied power, proving that the human spirit can, for a time, outmatch even the most formidable armies. This moment, preserved in speeches, diaries, and the collective memory of a nation, became more than history. It became legend, a demonstration that leadership and conviction can carry a country when all else has fallen away. Churchill's voice had replaced certainty, allies, and strength, ensuring that Britain would endure, and that the world would remember that standing firm, even alone, can alter the course of history.